A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, and with me, as always, is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Welcome to the Gab community, and just a reminder that you can listen to this episode and all previous episodes on many of your favorite apps, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and on YouTube. The show runs on the 405media.com weekdays at 11 a.m. and weekends at 5 p.m. I always upload the show to our website, thedailystir.com. And we want to welcome powellmediainc.com. They are also broadcasting The Horrible, Deplorable Show. With all of these apps, just search for The Horrible, Deplorable Show, and you should be able to find it. So the president gave a State of the Union address. Doris really enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah. Trump was magnificent. His best speech, very presidential, was comprehensive and well delivered. I love the parts about booming economy and bringing jobs home. The bonus checks that he talked about that several corporations are making to their employees. Billions of new dollars are being invested by American companies. He was heavy in support of first responders and law enforcement. And he even touched the taboo subjects of being in favor of God and our flag. Infrastructure, you would think he would get some hoorays from the other side on infrastructure, but did he? No. He's taking care of our military and vets. He brought that up. And something really interesting is that he wants to lower medical prescription costs. And for the people out there that are terminally ill and can't get drugs that haven't been approved yet, he's suggesting that they be allowed to go ahead and get those unapproved drugs.
So that's called the right to try. A lot of people had very good reactions to the speech. Doris is a good gauge for me on this. Doris, I'm sure you noticed the visuals, like when he was talking about black unemployment being way down, they cut to the Congressional Black Caucus, and none of them are standing. None of them in the entire Democrat caucus stood basically for anything. At what point Luis Gutierrez stormed out because people were chanting USA, USA. There's also a clip of Joe Manchin who gets all excited about something. I'm sure it was probably the president saying we've ended the war on clean coal or something. And there's this clip of him like moving to get up. He's clapping, and you can tell he's about to just sort of reflexively stand up, and then he looks around and realizes that he's not allowed to do that, and he kind of retreats back into his bench. What did you think about the reaction of the Democrats, and how do you think the public views that?
Oh my. Sourpuss Nancy, they featured the camera on her quite a bit, but it was really disappointing. I mean, supposedly the Democrats are supposed to represent at least half of America, and they did nothing to show that. They may as well have just stayed home for all that they could show. They showed nothing. It was really embarrassing, I think, to know that you have a legislator back there that's a Democrat that couldn't even stand up for our military or our flag or infrastructure even, things that benefit them.
Well, they were showing their voters that they are the resistance. And I actually think it's a good thing that they did what they did, because what has happened is we've stopped pretending. If the Democrats had stood for God and the flag and all that, I wouldn't have believed them. So the fact that they're sitting and they're now finally willing to kind of own the views that they actually have internally and to project outwardly the way I know they talk to each other when they're behind closed doors, that's good. It's good because the truth will set you free. And and we're going to talk throughout this episode today about civil war and the possibility of civil war and all of that, and these are unpleasant topics, but just because things are unpleasant and just because our things are not the way we would like them to be doesn't mean that we can make them better by pretending that it's not true. And what I liked about the State of the Union address was that everybody made it very clear where they stand. and the fact that this country is so divided and that we no longer have common principles that we can agree on. We've been pretending for some period of time that that's not true. And things aren't getting better by pretending that it's not true. And I do think things are going to get worse before they get better. And I really hope that violence can be avoided, because civil wars ultimately lead to violence. But no matter what, if there is some better place to get to, whether violence is the path along the way or not, we can never get to that better place if we aren't honest about what's really going on, about what people believe. If we cannot be honest about the fact that there's very little that both sides can agree on, then there's no way to get to some accommodation or to figure out who goes and who stays. Whatever the resolution is, there's no way to get to that if you don't start by being honest about where things are. And the Democrats have been playing a game for a long time of pretending and then surreptitiously going about their business of fundamentally transforming the United States of America. And as we've talked about repeatedly in this podcast, it's been the Republican leadership's job to play the part of the Washington generals, to lose gracefully, but to lose, and to collect their check, pat each other on the back, and go home. And what's happened with Trump, and again, we're going to talk about this more throughout the podcast today, but what's happened with Trump is that he's someone who doesn't come out of that Washington generals establishment. He ran specifically because he was angered by that constant throwing of the fight, and he wanted to confront it directly, and he wanted to actually deliver real, substantive victories for conservatives, lasting victories. And that freaked out not only our side, filled with never-Trumpers, but it's caused the entire left to drop the pretense. You see, they were only willing to come out in the shiny uniforms and show their tricks with the basketball, dribble it and let it run along their arms and around their back and, have all this fun pulling the pants down of the Washington generals and playing like clowns for the kids. That's only fun when you know you're still going to win, when you know the other side is still paid to throw the game. Believe me, the Harlem Globetrotters would play much more seriously, and they would dunk the ball a lot harder if those guys who are paid to come out and lose against them actually tried to score points and actually tried to win the game. The fun and the clowning would stop pretty quick in a game that you were watching between those two teams. And that's what's happened here, is because Republican voters have elected somebody who has no intention of throwing the fight and no intention of losing gracefully, and who is actually going to fight for substantive victories to defeat the left. They've dropped the pretense. They've stopped pretending that we all get along and that they believe in God and veterans and, the country and all those kinds of things, because they don't, and they never did. And if you're seriously going to challenge us, they're saying, then we're going to fight you hard. No more game playing. It's on. Well, none of that's pleasant. None of that is pleasant, but it is the truth.
But you hear so many people writing letters and expressing opinions that if they would just compromise, well, did the Democrats look like they were willing to compromise on anything? Look at that audience. It was horrible.
As I've said repeatedly, compromise for the I'm not the only one that says this, but you hear it from others as well. But the compromise to the Democrats is when we give them what they want. You see, that's bipartisanship, too.
I see.
Notice, for instance, when there was that shutdown fight. This is a classic example, by the way. There are a billion examples of this. But when the shutdown fight came, there was a vote in the Senate, ultimately, that led to the shutdown. It was about passing the continuing resolution. And there were 3 or 4, maybe only 2 or 3 Republicans that didn't vote for that. They sided with the Democrats. But there were also 3 or 4 Democrats that voted with the Republicans for the continuing resolution, mostly Democrats that are in red states that are worried about their upcoming reelection. But the press framed it as that there was bipartisan opposition to the bill, and therefore there was a bipartisan vote for a shutdown. You see, again, when Republicans cross the line and vote with Democrats, that's bipartisanship. When it's just a handful, it's still bipartisanship. When a handful of Democrats cross over and vote with Republicans, that doesn't mean anything.
Well, those Democrats don't mean anything after that. I mean, they've betrayed their party.
State of the Union addresses are essentially a political act. it's a performance. And from that standpoint, because it's one of the few times that a lot of Americans who don't pay close attention to politics, they do tune in and they watch. And I think the president did very well. He was very well served by his speechwriters, whether that was Stephen Miller or others involved. I think they knew that they were going to deal with Democrats who would probably not be standing, and they gave the president really good lines to utter that would create a great visual for John Q. Public to see Democrats not standing.
You mean like the Americans are dreamers too?
Yes, nuclear lines like that and many others. Some of the stories that he told, it was just good stuff. As far as theater goes, it was very good stuff. On the release the memo issue, I thought maybe the memo was coming out today. It looks like it may get delayed till tomorrow. At this point, we're kind of under 24-hour delays, so there's absolutely no guarantee that it is going to come out tomorrow. The Democrats are playing their games. One of the latest things was that Adam Schiff, the Democrat leader of the House Intel Committee, who is clearly totally partisan and simply connected to the deep state as far as trying to thwart everything. And he's the one that hyped the Russian story for months and claimed there was there, and yet there's nothing has come out. And he's even had to back off of some of his claims because he was just part of that whole hoax. He has zero credibility and he's clearly an empty vessel. But he pulled a little trick on the Republicans. Besides writing his own memo and then going out and crying about the fact that the Democrat memo is not being released with the Republican one, even though he wrote his memo weeks after the Republican one. And the Republicans are following the House rules, which was you have to release it to the whole membership first, where they can read it, and then you can have a vote to release it to the White House to okay it. I mean, there's this step-by process with classified products, and the Republicans have done that, and their memo is about to get released. The Democrats write a memo in the last 5 or 6 days, and they want it released at the same time. And then when the Republicans say, no, but we'll vote to release it to the membership, we will start the process so that it can move through this House rule process and eventually come out. Of course, Schiff runs right out and says, they blocked my memo, but they're releasing their own. It's all just partisan. And the Republican, Nunes and the others have to come out and say, no, we'll release the Democrat memo if it doesn't have classified sources and methods in it, and we've started the process and we've released it to all the membership to read, and it'll go through this step-by-step process. Of course, the media dutifully repeats all that crap. I see that MSNBC the other day actually asked the question on their channel, is Nunes a Russian agent? Which is just, that's just batshit crazy. I mean, that's just nuts.
And CNN also did that.
And so the president has apparently read it. So Schiff's most recent trick was to point out some grammatical errors in the memo and apparently ask for one or two other very minor changes. And the Republicans grant his request. And then as soon as they do that, he says, okay, now the memo is materially different, so you have to start the whole process over again. And of course, Nunes and the others have said, no, we're not going to do that. And they've explained that fixes were grammatical and that there was no significant change or substantive change to the memo at all. But of course, you got the media out there dutifully parroting, what Schiff is saying again. It's amazing. I've noticed people from the Wall Street Journal and even Cheryl Atkinson, who used to be with CBS and has her own show, Full Measure, they've all come out and said that it's amazing the kind of resistance to this memo, including Cheryl had a really good tweet where she said, there are a lot of groups that are usually their whole basis for being is government transparency, and they're on the side of holding this memo back. So it just shows you there are a lot of people who are just sort of paid opposition out there. And I think a lot of fears around what's coming out in this memo and maybe other material is that it looks like Fusion GPS, as part of the millions of dollars they had, once they'd created this phony dossier, they were shopping it around to established contacts in the media, and there is some suggestion they may actually have contracts with media members that they pay to put out information. And I think there are a number of people in the mainstream media who are deathly afraid of that kind of information coming out. I mean, it would end careers if it was revealed that they were receiving money as journalists.
We don't know what will be unmasked, do we?
It's quite interesting. But I think, all of this stuff, the way the tricks they've been playing to try to prevent the memo and the fact that they'll take any position. Look at how staunchly they're defending the FBI and the DOJ now. I mean, they're now huge supporters of the FBI when they were all on the side of Black Lives Matter and for reduced sentences and the idea that the law enforcement had too many tools and was too aggressive and they were all on the side of Guantanamo closing, and this whole idea that the intelligence community and the law enforcement communities, they're the ones that have been pushing for 15 years that these are jackbooted thugs, they've overstepped their power, that they're going around persecuting average Americans. And then the moment that there might be some suggestion that they did something untoward to the Trump campaign, now these folks, to a person, they're all staunch defenders of the intelligence community and law enforcement. And how dare you impugn their integrity, they say. It's absolutely fascinating. And then the same people who claimed that Bush lied about weapons of mass destruction and that the CIA has been a tool for overthrowing tin pot governments all over the world, and that they're basically part of projecting America's power and imperialism, and just nothing positive to say about the intelligence community for something like 40 years. Now that there's some suggestion that the intelligence community might have been involved in spying on the Trump campaign, they're like, you're trying to tear at the fabric of our intelligence communities and the good hard work that these decent people do to protect this country every day. I mean, folks, as if you needed any more examples of the 180-degree tactics that I've described, although I've thought about renaming it 360-degree tactics because there's literally no direction they won't shoot from to accomplish their goal. The point is that there is no position or principle that they hold. And they didn't really care about the CIA overthrowing dictatorships or elected governments in Latin America. They don't care about these things because it's just a tool to undermine the United States. And so when taking that position helps to undermine a Republican administration, then they're all for it. When the Democrats are in power, like when Obama was there, notice how quiet they got about drone strikes and the body counts. They didn't even bother with the body counts. The New York Times immediately stopped publishing the list, the pictures. They were doing headshots of every soldier killed when Bush was president. And then as soon as Obama was elected, they just stopped that feature of their newspaper. They stopped publishing the headshots of every dead soldier. And then as Obama's body count of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan surpassed Bush's, the Bush administration was responsible for more U.S. soldier deaths in Iraq. But most people don't know this. The Obama administration is actually responsible for more soldier deaths, U.S. soldier deaths in Afghanistan under their 8 years. That surpassed the Bush administration. But did you see the New York Times start publishing the faces of every dead soldier? I mean, we're still in Afghanistan. So there was no push to end that war because the push to end the Iraqi war wasn't an opposition to the Iraqi war. They don't care about any of that. It's all just about what position do they need to take to be against the Republican administration, to be against those people who proudly defend the country. And so they'll be against the CIA when it suits their purposes. And now when it suits their purposes to defend the CIA, they'll happily have a little breakfast in the morning and come out that day and have the exact opposite opinions. That's just who they are. Between their hatred of America, their unwillingness to accept any limits on the means used to acquire power, and their complete derangement, their mental illness, how can we ever allow them to hold power in this country again? And we're going to talk about more about that towards the back end of this podcast. But I have promised to do a Trump one-year report card and a congressional one-year report card, and I am going to get to that. Before we do, though, we need to talk about the immigration plan that the president put out, and that he is apparently at the congressional retreat today, hectoring them in the Senate to move his plan.
Well, on immigration, I think that most Americans support immigrating, the best immigrants that we can find that want to come here. However, Trump's offer that he recently proposed to the Dems is much too much, giving away too much for what we get in return.
A lot of people out there who are very strong Trump supporters, and I put myself in that camp, but there are others out there who take it to the point where they want to claim that Trump's always operating 4D chess, or that it's 20D chess, or it's a billion-D chess, that he's just this brilliant savant that the world has never seen before, and that everything he does is a highly calculated move that knows what his opponents are going to do 24 steps down the road. I'm not willing to take it that far. I think that it's certainly possible that the president put out the plan knowing that the Democrats would reject it, and that it would position them very well to look like they tried to compromise and the Democrats won't. And I totally give him that. I think the message is clear that the Democrats, he's asking them to give up this idea of importing a new electorate into the United States for the sake of regularizing these illegals that were brought here as minors, and that they are rejecting that, and that it highlights the stark differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. My main concern, though, is that even if they do reject this deal now, and I think a lot of this is about their thought that they're going to take the House in November, and so they have no interest in making a deal and giving away long-term changes on immigration when they think they're going to regain some power shortly. Probably after November, if they fail to take the House, they're going to be much more interested in an immigration bill, because a couple of defeats, 2 elections in a row like that, usually starts to create some fractures in the losing coalition as people start to think about how to rebuild or how to save their own skins or what have you. My problem with the proposal is that it becomes the new starting point. If and when there ever is an actual serious discussion about immigration reform, it's not like you're going to be able to ask for more than what's in this plan. This becomes the starting point, and you negotiate down from that. It gets worse from there as you begin to negotiate with the other side. And that's why I would have liked to have seen a plan that was more aggressive and that gave the president some room for giveaways. Because at this point, it's already a bad plan. As I said, we hope that it was simply a PR tactic. But if you have to negotiate worse from here, that's no better, obviously.
Well, see, I don't agree with you there. They didn't accept what Trump thought was a generous plan. So not accepting that, he may not be so generous next time around.
Well, but it's the point I made before when Chuck Schumer offered to pay for the wall to try to get the shutdown stopped because he realized he'd backed himself in a corner and it didn't look very good for them. And then he came out afterwards and said, the wall's off the table. I'm not offering that anymore. Problem is once he's offered the wall, he's acknowledged that the wall's on the table, right? Because they had said no way ever would they fund the wall, no how. And now that he walked into the room and offered the wall to the president, obviously that means the wall has to be part of any deal going forward. And the Democrats have already acknowledged that it's something they're willing to negotiate on. You see how the whole negotiation changes the moment you take an extreme position, and then once you come off that extreme position, you can never really go back to it because you've shown it's really not your extreme position. When you say, no how, no way, I'll never do this, and then 2 days later you say, well, I might be willing to do that. Well, now it's negotiable, you see. It's no longer no way, no how. And I feel that since the president, has offered this, that becomes the starting point for negotiation. He's not going to, again, if the objective is never to reach an accommodation, fine. That's fine, and you can take any position you want. You can even back up and become more aggressive and ask for even more. But you're never going to reach an accommodation. The other side's going to walk away, and that's okay. That's fine. That would be the outcome that I would prefer. But in any actual negotiation, it's not good faith to stake out a position, and then once the other side starts negotiating with you, to back up and to say, now I want more, that will draw all negotiations to a close. So I guess it comes down to whether or not you think the president is making a good faith offer or not.
Yeah, I don't think he did. I think he expected the Dems to turn it down so he could look good at accepting all these immigrants, and it was really the Democrats that said no. So I think, he's done nothing normal yet. So why should he negotiate in the normal way?
Well, that's certainly what I wish to believe. I won't go so far as to make the argument that it's 20D chess, but I'm very open to the idea that they were taking a calculated risk that the Democrats would never negotiate. And I think it was a decent risk because, as I said, I don't believe the Democrats are motivated to negotiate when they think they're going to pick up the House in November. If I were them and I believed what they believed, I wouldn't negotiate. Why would you give away permanent changes to the immigration plan that currently exists in law that allows you to import a new electorate? Why would you give that up if you thought you were going to gain the House back and maybe be able to impeach this guy after November? I think the only way the Democrats ever really come to the table and negotiate is when they have concluded that would be the best deal they would ever get. In other words, not negotiating would be worse. And if they lose in November and they begin to get the message that maybe they don't have a path to regain the House or Senate, and there's a decent chance the president might win re-election in 2020, after a loss in November, I think you'll see members, not people like Pelosi, but individual members beginning to peel off Democrats who are up for re-election in 2020 and the rest, starting to look for a way to save their own skin and acknowledge that the ground has shifted on this. But I think, usually one election doesn't do that. It takes two elections in a row for a party to begin to kind of fracture and for individual members to start looking for lifeboats to save themselves.
Well, the disrespect the Dems showed during the State of the Union address, a lot of people are going to remember that, even Democrats. And I think they're going to get less support for changing out the House than they think they are.
Yeah, I had said a few weeks ago that I was concerned, and I still remain concerned, that Republicans may lose the House, but not the Senate. I will say, though, that the more confident the Democrats become, and the more I see press, polling, and the rest treating it like it's a fait accompli, that it's absolutely gonna happen, that's when I start to believe that it's less likely. So I watch the press as sort of a temperature gauge, because I know they're huge hoaxers, and that they oftentimes, believe the fake it till you make it school of journalism, which is that if you want something to happen, like Trump losing the election, you simply act as if it's inevitable and that that's what's going to happen, hoping to sort of, stampede the sheeple into giving you what you want. So if throughout 2018 I see stories that are kind of tempered, in which the press says, it could go either way, there's a risk Republicans could lose the House, then I'm going to be more inclined to believe that it's possible. When they start writing articles about Democrats are shopping for the drapes in their new offices when they take over, and that it's an inevitability, and when I start reading stories about Republicans preparing to lose the House and what their plan is once that happens, that's when I start to think it's not going to happen, you see, because I know the way the press operates. And when they're confident, they would vacillate. And when they are insecure, that's when they pretend that something is going to happen, for sure. Let's talk for a minute about the military budget. This may be a topic that some of my listeners will disagree with me on. That's okay, but I feel a need to explain this in some detail, and so you'll know where I stand. But the president has already increased the military budget once, and they've put out a budget proposal for FY19, and it's $716 billion, so it's another significant increase in the military budget. And the big cry from the Republicans on the Hill is that they want to separate this deal they've had with the Democrats to increase domestic spending along with military spending. They want to break that connection so that they can go on increasing the military budget and either flatline or have slower growth for the discretionary budget, the domestic budget. I'm all for cutting the domestic budget. Problem is I don't support increases in military spending. I'm fully aware that the military is overstretched and that we could take care of our veterans better and that we could pay our soldiers better and equip them better and that there's equipment that needs to be replaced. But my argument is that we are overstretched because we do not spend enough money compared to the mission that we have given the military to do, which is to project itself all over the world, including in the Middle East and in Afghanistan and in Germany and in Japan and South Korea and lots of other places. And we maintain a large military to meet that mission. And I would agree with anybody that would argue we don't spend enough money to fulfill that mission, which is essentially predicated under the idea, and there's this process the military goes through every 10 years where they talk about what the military stance should be, what should be the mission that we are trying to budget towards. And for a number of decades now, that mission has been that we have to be prepared to fight 2 wars in different places on the planet simultaneously. That's the objective, to be ready at any time to fight 2 wars in 2 different places on the planet. And it is because that is the objective, then, that you craft a budget and you decide how many Navy ships and how many tanks and what your overall personnel levels need to be in order to meet that goal. It is that goal that I disagree with, because it is that mission that probably $716 billion is not enough to pay for. And the only way to bring the military budget down is to re-ask those tough questions about what the mission should be and whether or not we actually need to be ready to fight 2 wars simultaneously at different places on the planet. What if we just need to be ready to fight 1 war somewhere on the planet and have a contingency plan for, like, say, in the case of World War II, how we would ratchet up the men and material that we needed to fight a second war, say, over a 6 or a 12-month period. We did it in World War II. We were able to move very quickly to industrialize and produce what we needed in order to fight a worldwide conflagration. So, do we need to have a standing army ready tomorrow to fight 2 wars? Or would it be okay if we had a standing army ready to fight 1 war, but a plan to ramp up our military over a 6 or 12-month period to be ready to fight a second war if needed? That sounds eminently reasonable to me. And yet, if that were the plan, if we told the military you need to be ready to fight one war and be ready to ratchet up in 12 months a second war, well, then suddenly the men and material needs is reduced. And suddenly you don't need $716 billion. My argument would be that a pretty good military budget would be, say, all of the other militaries of the world combined. Or say, what if we targeted 80%? We're going to spend 80% of what all the other militaries in the world spend combined. Because, folks, we're already spending that. So I'm all for the idea that we need to be the biggest, we have to have the biggest stick on the block, that we have to have the most powerful military. Absolutely. But we can accomplish that goal and not spend at the levels at which we're spending. So it's partly that mission. It's also the fact that there's this sort of institutional bias towards big machines, really expensive planes, really expensive ships. A lot of that is because these very expensive things get built somewhere in the United States. Planes, ships, tanks, and the rest. And that's a lot of jobs. And so you have a lot of people in Congress who want to defend the jobs that build those things. But it may be that drones, for instance, can do a lot of things and you don't need as many planes. But then, of course, drones, when you think about that, think of how much smaller they are, how much less expensive they are to build. That translates into fewer jobs at the end of the day. So there are some hard questions that have to be asked. And this idea of just kind of reflexively increasing the budget, I think, has to be resisted. And it's not about the fact that I'm not pro-military or that I have a son who's a veteran. I want everybody to be taken care of. The issue is that you'll always find an excuse to spend more. We could spend $716 billion. We could spend $1 trillion. We could spend $2 trillion on a military. There's always things that you can spend money on. But when we're running the kind of deficits we're running, it doesn't make a lot of sense. When we have a military that is so much bigger than everyone else combined, it doesn't necessarily make as much sense. And again, as I've tried to explain, what we're doing is based on very specific mission goals. And if you simply dial down the mission goals a little, you don't have to spend as much. And you can do a heck of a lot with, say, $500 billion or $550 billion. That's a lot of money. You can run a pretty big, scary military for that kind of money. That's my thoughts on that. I know there's some people out there that want to champion increased spending on the military no matter what. But I don't think we can have a reasonable conversation about bringing down budget levels, including domestic budgets and all the things that those of us who are conservatives think are a complete waste of time. I get that. But in this world, with American population made up of who it's made up of, we cannot have a successful discussion about reducing the budget and paying down the debt unless we're willing to have a serious discussion about doing so with the military budget as well. Okay, so I promised that we would do the report card, and I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. Mostly grades did not. I'm going to start with the cabinet secretaries, and then I'm going to get to the president and Congress. Mostly grades didn't change because, and I went back and looked at the 6-month list, there really weren't a lot of changes in the second 6 months of this year. Starting with Scott Pruitt, who I gave an A+ to before, he maintains an A+. He is my favorite cabinet secretary because he is aggressively cutting the EPA and reducing that. I wish the other cabinet secretaries were cutting their agencies as much as Scott Pruitt is. I read a headline the other day, lamenting that it may take a decade or two for the EPA to recover from what Scott Pruitt is doing. A, that's fantastic news. But B, I doubt it. I think it would take a matter of 6 months for a Democrat like Obama back in power to get the EPA doing all sorts of crazy, nefarious crap again. But still, he's to be commended for doing everything that's within his power. He's being sued all over by blue state attorney generals, and that's a fantastic sign. I don't see a lot of other cabinet secretaries getting sued all over the place, and that's a good finger in the wind for figuring out of whether or not they're really ruffling waters. He's rolling back the Waters of the USA rules, which were just crazy ways to allow the EPA to use any puddle anywhere as a way to come on and limit building and construction and all the rest. Defense Secretary Mattis, I gave him a B+ at the 6 month. I'm going to move that down to a B-. Certainly ISIS is defeated, and he absolutely should be congratulated for that. Earlier, I had criticized him for speaking too highly of Hillary Rodham Clinton. I notice he's mostly shut up about that. I was concerned about the fact that he froze this ban on folks in the military for 6 months, and the courts have essentially stepped in and taken over on that. So that's going to get decided by judges ultimately, and I can't really blame General Mattis for however that turns out. We haven't seen a drawdown in Syria, but, they've been fighting ISIS. Hopefully that comes soon. We did see an increase in troop levels in Afghanistan. Also, little news out of Iraq. I'm not particularly happy, as I've said before, about the increased troop levels in Afghanistan. I'm willing to give Mattis and the president some short window of time, 12 months, to show some kind of progress in Afghanistan. But ultimately, at some point, reasonable people have to conclude that everything that it is possible to do in Afghanistan has been done, and it's time to go. There has been no major engagement anywhere. We haven't gone to war, and that is a good sign. I believe that in his heart of hearts, the president has no interest in military engagement anywhere around the world. His priorities are domestic. Matter of fact, it's pretty much the first Republican we've had in a very long time who's much more interested in his domestic agenda than in his foreign policy agenda. And I think that everything that the president does is designed around trying to avoid a conflict anywhere in the world, an actual expensive military conflict anywhere in the world, so that he can focus on his domestic agenda. And so I'm happy about that. But as I've just gone through, I am not happy about the constant increase in the military budget. And I think that has to be laid at Mattis, because I don't see any willingness on his part to go after some of these legacy building programs within the military and to revamp the budget in a way that would require less money and allow that money to go much, much further. So at the 6-month point with the Homeland Security Secretary, it was John Kelly, and I gave him a C. He has since moved over to the Chief of Staff position, and frankly, I think he's doing a pretty good job over there. So, I'd give him an A over there. He was replaced by Kristen Nielsen at Homeland Security, and I would move that grade up to a B-. Crossings at the southern border are actually up now. A lot of that has to do with some judicial decisions, but ICE is being aggressive, and I think the signals coming out of ICE are really good, but the numbers aren't. As I've said before, they need to add some zeros to these deportation numbers that they keep bragging about. I'll see some press release about how ICE arrested 50 people in Texas over the weekend, and I'm thinking, when you're dealing with upwards of 30 million illegals, 50 is not going to cut it on a weekend. It would need to be 500 on a weekend in order to be moving towards, we have to be deporting at least 1 million people a year. And I don't think we got anywhere near 1 million on this first year. I see with the wall that the prototypes have been built and the commandos have been set upon it to try to test it, which they gave it pretty good marks. So that's good. The deferred action for parents of Americans was withdrawn, and when it comes to DACA, I'm not a big fan of the president's proposal. There's been kind of mixed signals there, but in reality, what's actually happened is that we're headed towards a March deadline in which there aren't going to be any more renewals for DACA, and these kids are going to face deportation. So that's pretty good. I had said at the halfway point that there'd been no significant attacks. Since then, we had Las Vegas, and we don't exactly know what the motivation was behind that shooting, and it's remained too opaque, that investigation. At this point, I'm not willing to say that I think that it had any kind of a foreign connection to ISIS or anything like that, but it was a pretty significant attack, and ultimately, if you're going to call yourself the Homeland Security Secretary, you got to take the good with the bad. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lightzer, I gave him a C at the halfway point. I would upgrade that to a B-. There's been no significant move on the NAFTA talks, but they have placed some sanctions out there. We've had some major announcements on solar panels, on refrigerators, things like that. So there are little things that would, motivate me to move the grade up a little bit, but I don't see them causing enough trouble. There's been a lot of pushback. I'm seeing on my social media feeds these promoted ads from some group that's just been invented, I'm sure, by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to push for retaining NAFTA. And so, I'm seeing articles about how Republicans don't want the president to make any significant changes to NAFTA. There's a lot of pushback on this. And this goes to my point about how what you saw happen in the first year, as far as in Congress, was things that the chamber agrees with the president on. Things like tax cuts. They don't care about. They love that stuff. That's what they want. But when it comes to his nationalist agenda, they're all for deregulation, but when it comes to NAFTA and immigration, notice that there hasn't been a lot of progress on that stuff, and it's because the resistance is coming from within the Republican Party. And so grades are going to remain in the middling area for these secretaries, because I don't think they're being aggressive enough. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, I gave him a B- at the halfway point. End of the year, I'm going to give him a B, so slight improvement. The Supreme Court hasn't exactly ruled on the visa ban, but they did withdraw the injunction, which tells you, kind of telegraphs where they're going to go on their final decision. And so the president won on that, and that's good. He has been pushing to cut the State Department. I see even today that a prominent diplomat has decided to retire. I consider that draining the swamp. So all of, the press likes to do these breathless reports about all this talent at State Department at Foggy Bottom is leaving because they can't stand to work for Trump. And I'm thinking #winning. You get all of these longtime diplomats to leave, that's great. I don't happen to think that these are the smartest people in the room. This is the same kind of BS we've been sold about the intelligence community and everyone else, that they can do no wrong. And yet it's a lot of diplomats have made critical mistakes. The fact that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait was based on a career diplomat basically telegraphing him that the United States wouldn't get involved in internecine warfare in the Middle East. And then suddenly, of course, we had to do that. So there are a lot of bungles that have happened because of career bureaucrats, and I don't consider them the smarter people in the room. He's gotten a lot quieter, Tillerson has, in the second half of the year, and I think all of that's good. So slight uptick to a B. Small Business Administrator Linda McMahon. I gave her a C because basically, she makes no waves and isn't pissing anybody off, and that's not a good sign. And I'm not hearing anything about her cutting that agency, and so I'm not changing her grade from a C. Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, gets a D. That's all based on everything I said at the halfway point. No mass firings of disloyal staff, no mass arrests of leakers. He's been pretty quiet and loyal during the Russia drumbeat, so that's good. But the intel community is losing prestige. They absolutely have lost prestige. It's not like anybody on the left ever loved them, although they're pretending to right now. The fact that the intelligence community enjoys any kind of status in the society is basically based on conservatives, and they've managed to screw that up. This whole thing needs a shake-up, and I don't see it happening. I was also disappointed to see that the whole FISA warrant process was steamrolled through Congress before the Nunes memo without any significant changes. So for that reason and many more, Dan Coates gets a D. Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, I gave him a B, and basically no change. It's been nice to see that a couple monument designations in Utah were slightly rolled back, but I think he should have gone further, and there should be other monuments being cut back. Wasn't happy to see that after the whole Bundy prosecution fiasco, at which the BLM was majorly involved, where was the house cleaning? I haven't seen Ryan Zinke do anything to make a move on BLM and others and get rid of a bunch of people who were involved in all of that crap. Basically, he's good. That's why I'm giving him a B, but I don't see enough aggressiveness over there. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Now, this is a woman who I like and who supports school choice and a lot of things that I happen to care about. So on, where she stands on the issues, of course, I would give her very high marks. But I'm going to move her grade at the halfway point, which was a B+, down to a B, because she's been pretty quiet. And she was making a lot of people mad in the first 6 months, but she hasn't done a lot to make the left mad in the second 6 months. And frankly, when it comes to public schools and public universities, with these free speech zones and the social justice warring, and the just lousy performance standards that are out there across the country, this is just too important to be staying quiet on. She has a limited window to be the Secretary of Education, and she frankly should be making a lot more waves. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross is going to get a slight bump, and he and some other people that were involved in the tax cut legislation being passed are going to get bumped for that, and they're going to enjoy a great improvement because, hey, that was a huge accomplishment, and they were involved in that. So where are the budget cuts to commerce? I don't see it. This is a department that, spends $14 to $15 billion, and it doesn't need to spend that much. They actually control NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and I'm not seeing major changes there that need to happen. So there's been slow progress on the trade negotiation. And also, believe it or not, the census is underneath the Commerce Department. And while they did roll back a proposal from the Obama administration to be more aggressive on racial issues, which would not have been good, there's a lot more changes at census that could happen. So basically, it's pretty quiet over there at Commerce. But because he helped to get the tax cuts passed, I moved his grade from a C to a B+. Energy Secretary Rick Perry got a C at the 6-month point. He maintains a C. I mean, it's the same stuff I said at the half point. He's pretty quiet. I don't see them causing a lot of trouble. He's wasting his time there. He's among a number of cabinet secretaries that I just don't think are cut in the Trump mold, and they're not, or maybe it'd be better to say they're not cut in the Scott Pruitt mold, and they're not aggressively cutting their agencies. The reason it's a C and not just say a D or an F is because this country has achieved energy independence, and we are now exporting oil, producing more oil than we have since the 70s. So there have been tremendous gains in liberating us from the Mideast and from the rest of the world when it comes to our energy supply. And as I've said before on this podcast, this is a really, really, really big deal. So just for being somewhere near the planet as energy secretary when that happened, I'm going to shed some positive light on Rick Perry for that. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson. Now here's a guy I like, but I gave him a C- at the halfway point, and I'm not going to change the grade because I just don't hear anything out of HUD. Again, who's he ticking off? I mean, he got in trouble the other day because apparently there's a prayer group there, which is not uncommon. A lot of them are involved in morning prayer groups. And someone decided to write a negative piece about that, and then he came out and said, I'm not going to apologize for believing in God. Well, that's all great and wonderful, and I don't have any problem with that, but that has absolutely nothing to do with what's actually going on at HUD as far as budget cuts or reforming the agency or all the rest, and I don't see the kind of waves coming out of there. Again, I use Scott Pruitt as the model. If you're not being hated on by the press, I mean, that guy just went up to the Capitol in the last week and got absolutely grilled by Democrats. But of course, the State of the Union was all the press wanted to talk about, so it all just got washed away, I'm sure to the frustration of the environmental groups, because that was their one shot to try to rake Scott Pruitt over the coals, and it got almost no press attention. But he went up there and dutifully got smacked around, and now he's back at the EPA doing what he's doing every day, and I am basically pointing at all the other cabinet secretaries and saying, why can't you be like Scott Pruitt? And, I love Ben Carson as a person, but if he was going to take that job, I mean, even if he feels a little bit over his head, just have lunch every day with Scott Pruitt and take a notepad and ask him, what are the 10 things you're doing? And then just come back to your own agency, in this case HUD, and do those things. It's just not that hard. Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta gets a C. He got a C at the halfway point, no change. Again, a lot of this is because these folks have been really quiet in the second half of the year. I just haven't seen much out of them, so there's no reason to change their grade. Veterans Affairs Secretary David Shulkin. I gave him an A at the halfway point because of how aggressively he'd moved to make major changes at the VA, and I'm going to keep that grade. It was really a great first year. I had said at the halfway point they'd fired like 300 employees at the VA for non-performance, and then the president at the State of the Union upped that number to 1,500 that they'd fired. So they're doing a great job over there. At least, as far as a grade for their first year, they deserve an A. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, I gave her a B at the halfway point. I'm going to give her an A- now. She still gets too much love from the wrong elites, but you can tell how much they've turned on her that they began floating a rumor that she was having an affair with the president. That's a good sign as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's despicable, and those people should be met in a back alley and punched in the face. You shouldn't be spreading those kinds of rumors. I mean, again, these are the same people who are spending all day long talking about #MeToo and how women are treated terribly in the workplace. And then they have no compunction about spreading a rumor that Nikki Haley's having an affair with the president, which is just bogus and stupid on its face. But the point is, it's designed to run her down, okay? And it's also a sign that they absolutely hate the job she's doing at the UN, vigorously defending the president's desire to push an American first agenda. They moved the embassy, or announced that the embassy's moving to Jerusalem, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and then there was a condemnation vote in the UN, and all along the way, Nikki Haley's been taking the punches and punching back and been making very aggressive statements at the UN. There even are a couple of UN agencies that we've pulled out of, committees and commissions that we won't work with anymore. That's all under her watch, so that's why I'm going to move her grade up to an A-. I think she's been faithfully projecting his message and doing it in an unafraid fashion, and she deserves commendation.
Plus, she said, I will remember how some of you voted.
That's the kind of aggressive, unafraid condemnation that I like to give her. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, I gave him a C at the halfway point. I'm going to move that up to a B, mostly because he was involved in the fight for the tax cuts, and that was a big accomplishment, and it got passed. I still think there needs to be a lot more transparency at the Fed, and I don't see him aggressively pushing for that. CIA Director Mike Pompeo, C- at the halfway point, no change. Again, I just think it's the same stuff I said about Dan Coates. The CIA and the intelligence community have taken a lot of hits that they've deserved, and I don't see the change that needs to occur happening over there. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, I gave a D, no change. The big thing for her is going to be the infrastructure bill. None of that happened in the first year. It's very possible that the focus is going to be on her in 2018, but, we haven't seen anything out of her so far, and she certainly hasn't been doing anything to downsize her agency, so no change on her grade. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, I gave him a B+. I'm going to move that down to a B-. I love the guy, but I just don't see the aggressive action. He should not have recused himself on the Russian thing. Hopefully, when the Nunes memo comes out, he will move aggressively to clean out the FBI and DOJ. There's also an Inspector General's report coming out in March, and I'm hoping he's using all of that, just biding his time to flush all those people out. But, he makes these threats against sanctuary cities, but I haven't seen any actual arrests yet. Where's the actual follow-through? I know some people are upset with him over the decision that they made around marijuana, that there'd been this Obama memo to the little district attorneys telling them not to prioritize that. And he rescinded that memo, and a lot of people who are pro-marijuana legalization got upset about that. I'm not really that worried about it. It wasn't exactly a memo to tell people to get aggressive about it. I think he felt that a lot of these memos the Obama administration put out were extra constitutional, that the law is the law, and you don't issue memos telling attorneys what to prioritize. And so he simply rescinded that memo. When I see them actually getting aggressive on marijuana enforcement, I'll agree that that's probably not where his priorities should lie. But right now, I'm not that concerned about it. Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney. I gave him an A- at the halfway point. I'm moving it down to a B+. And it's only because I don't see the cuts. It looks like we may end up with another continuing resolution throughout this year. So the fact that the Congress, he's got to take some responsibility for the fact that Congress can't pass any budget. And of course, he's, pushing that military budget increase. So I have to dock him a little for that. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, I gave him a D before, and I'm not going to change it. I don't really think this guy is anything other than an institutional player. I don't think any significant changes are going to occur at the Agricultural Department, and I think he's a huge supporter of NAFTA. Of course, NAFTA benefits the agricultural community more than any other in the United States. But because I think that his time at ag will be completely wasted and that no downsizing will occur there when it needs to be, his grade is going to remain a D. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar just took the job 3 days ago. Tom Price had it before. I gave him a C at the halfway point. I'd give him a final grade of an F. He was brought on to get Obamacare repealed. He had a plan to do that, and it never happened. It's impossible to score Azar at this point since he's only had the job for 3 days. Vice President Mike Pence, I gave him a C at the halfway point. I'd move that up to a B. He's pretty dutiful and takes his role as vice president pretty seriously as far as kind of knowing the limits of that. And I see now that he's basically kind of gotten on the campaign trail and he's going to be out there kind of aggressively pounding on red state Democrats to help turn some of these seats over, especially in the Senate. So he knows his role and he's doing it pretty good. I'm always a little hesitant on him because I think that there is a part of him that's biding his own time. And for that reason, it's going to remain a B. When it comes to POTUS and the GOP, the grades really have not changed much. When it comes to immigration, that grade was a C for Trump, or C-. I would move it up slightly to a C because there's been some movement on building the wall, but not a lot. And illegal border crossings are up, but he has reduced refugee admissions. So, those are way down, and those refugees that are coming in are mostly Christians. So the GOP continues to get an F on that issue. The budget, I moved it from a B+ to a B-. The military increases have got to stop. At some point, we got to get serious about reforming within the military so that we just don't constantly try to increase that budget. I think it's a lazy move. It shows an unwillingness to take on difficult issues. And as far as the budget as a whole, I'm not seeing the cuts. The GOP continues to get an F from me because they can't pass a budget. On regulatory reform, no change. Trump gets an A, the GOP gets a B. There have been massive regulatory cuts, and all of that is just a shining element of this report card. On healthcare, I gave him a B at the halfway point. Trump, I have to give him a C now because the Obamacare repeal didn't happen. GOP, I gave them a D, now they get a D+. And the only reason they get a slight increase is because they did pass within the tax cuts that repeal of the Obamacare mandate. Taking care of our vets, no change really. There have been pay raises. I'm still waiting for them to let vets see their own doctor, but they have moved in that direction. There are some good proposals on the way. And like I said, they fired 1,500 bad VA employees. They synced the Department of Defense and VA computers. I moved the GOP up from a B to an A as well. On foreign policy, no grade change. Trump gets a B-, GOP gets an F. And the main reason is just how overextended we are out there. The fact that we increased troop levels in Afghanistan, that's not a good sign. I do like to see that the president has tried to de-escalate issues with Russia. ISIS was defeated. That's a really good thing. That's, part of why the grade's pretty good for the president, B-. But he hasn't held China as accountable as he claimed on the campaign trail that he would. The Jerusalem decision was good. On energy and environment, A+. GOP, I gave a D. I'd move that up to a C, mostly because to the extent that there have been all these great advancements on energy and environmental issues, it's come from the White House and not from Congress. On infrastructure, it's no grade for the president because he's yet to actually announce a full infrastructure package, let alone push one. And for the GOP, I give him an F because this was a priority of theirs and they couldn't move it in the first year. On trade and jobs, I gave the president a C. Move that up to a B+. GOP gets, though they had an F, I'm going to move it to a C, mostly because of the tax cuts that passed. And, the fact that money's flowing back into the United States as a result of that. Manufacturing jobs are up. President hasn't labeled China a currency manipulator, though, and we've seen no actual, really significant move on the NAFTA negotiations. I think I'll save grading Trump's promises. I'll go over that on the next podcast next week. But I do want to get to a couple of points towards the end here. First of all, I noticed that celebrities, not only have they just gone nuts, and I don't think that anybody on our side takes them seriously, but to the extent that their opinion seems to matter, I think it's worth remembering that for thousands of years, entertainers were known as court jesters, and they were considered the least important person in the room. And no one cared what the court jester's opinion was on matters of state. As far as this issue of civil war, there's a couple of op-eds, columns, blogs, whatever you want to call them, that have come out in the last week that I want to quote from because I think they were pretty well written. And I'm going to, hopefully if I remember, put the links to them on the website and maybe even in the YouTube posting. I'll put the links there if I can figure out how to do that. But I want you to hear from this. So one of them is this guy Z-Man who writes the Z blog. If you follow on Gab, you probably read his stuff before. But he says, I just want to quote from him in this column he titled, Who's in Charge? Quote, Steve Saylor is fond of talking about the deep state, mostly as a way to explain how the people in the ruling class collude with one another against the interests of the voters and their elected officials. It's not a conspiracy, with Ernst Blomfeld controlling the world from his secret lair. It's more like a community of like-minded people who exist within the high ground of the society. They hire one another, they socialize, their kids marry each other, and they try to keep elected officials from screwing up their grand designs. Ellipsis, down to another part of his op-ed where he says, the proof that liberalism is a cult is that the members are sure they are a revolutionary vanguard, defending the status quo against the general public. That's a degree of madness that exists only in mental hospitals and revivals. It's why there is no reasoning with a progressive. They have descended into madness. And lastly from him, the people in charge have gone insane. The orgy of anti-Americanism, particularly the hatred for whites, is a group psychosis. Fixing this is not going to happen with elections. End quote. And then I want to read a bit from this blog by this guy Daniel Greenfeld. He gave a speech to the South Carolina Tea Party Coalition Convention in Myrtle Beach, and this is a transcript of that speech. And they're just a few pieces that I want to read that are of a similar vein. Quote, it's not guns that make a civil war, it's politics. Guns are how a civil war ends. Politics is how it begins. Two or more sides disagree on who runs the country, and they can't settle the question through elections because they don't even agree that elections are how you decide who's in charge. That's the basic issue here. Who decides who runs the country? When you hate each other but accept the election results, you have a country. When you stop accepting election results, you have a countdown to a civil war. First time a Republican president was elected this century, they said he didn't really win. What are the odds of the Democrats rejecting the next Republican president? If so, it means they don't accept the results of any election, they don't win. It means they don't believe that transfers of power in this country are determined by elections. That's a civil war. The only legitimate exercise of power in this country, according to the left, is its own. Whenever Republicans exercise power, it's inherently illegitimate. The attacks on Trump show that elections don't matter to the left. They lost Congress, they lost the White House, so what do? They began trying to rule the country through federal judges and bureaucrats. Whether it's federal or state, executive, legislative, or judiciary, the left moves power around to run the country. If it controls an institution, then that institution is suddenly the supreme power in the land. This is what I call a moving dictatorship. There isn't one guy in a room somewhere issuing orders. Instead, there's a network of them, and the network moves around. If the guys and girls in the network win elections, they can do it from the White House. If they lose the White House, they'll do it from Congress. If they don't have either one, they'll use the Supreme Court. If they don't have either the White House, Congress, or the Supreme Court, they're screwed, right? Nope. They just go on issuing them through circuit courts and the bureaucracy. State governments announce that they're independent republics. Corporations begin threatening and suing the government. There's no consistent legal standard, only a political one. Okay, so that's Daniel Greenfield. I read from both of their blogs because it is exactly the same as you've been hearing from me on this podcast. I would love to believe that this can be avoided, but pretending that it isn't true isn't the way to avoid a civil war. That's a road to slavery, in which, because you don't want to have a civil war, or you don't even want to contemplate that a civil war is going on, you simply surrender. Because that's your only alternative. If the other side is determined to obliterate you, and by that I mean to politically obliterate you so that only their viewpoint is allowed, and that only their policies will be enacted. If that is their view, then you have only two choices: to engage and defeat them, or to surrender. And it's not a pleasant reality. I'm not happy about it, but avoiding it doesn't make it any less a fact. Doris and I saw 12 Strong this week. Doris, what did you think?
Well, first of all, Chris Hemsworth was surprisingly strong in this depiction of a true story that helps us understand the actual conditions under which our troops fight in Afghanistan. Brutal terrain. What I found rather almost unbelievable about the movie was that it was amazing that with all these bullets that were flying, only a couple of the 12 strong were wounded, and all came home. The movie celebrated patriotism and mostly American grit. I enjoyed it and would give it an A-.
So I give it a B, and I give it the positive side of that. The way it gets all the way up to a B is that it is basically an enjoyable movie, and it's certainly pro-American, so you're not going to get any social justice warrioring bullcrap, and it's just a nice, relaxing time at the movies. The reason I can't go much higher than a B is that even though I'm perfectly happy with the subject, and I'm glad that it's not leftist trope, it isn't the best movie that's ever been made. It certainly feels more like an action movie than an actual war movie, and I think they've taken, I suspect, they've taken a lot of liberties with it, because as you said, there are too many scenes where too many AKs are shooting at them for them all to essentially walk away as unscathed as they were. And so I suspect that some of the scenes that are depicted of extreme heroism probably didn't go down exactly like that. And again, I mean, there are moments in this where it really feels more like a Hollywood action movie than it does a faithful retelling of a war experience. But, you know, there aren't a lot of pro-American, pro-military movies out there. So for that reason, I certainly would recommend it if that's of interest to you. But if you're expecting it to, you know, be on the order of, say, the Benghazi movie, 13 Hours, or Black Hawk Down, or Zero Dark 30, it's not up to those levels. That's about all the time that we have for this program. You can listen to this episode and previous episodes on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, YouTube. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow, so I am hoping that you will share this podcast with one other Trump supporter so that we can grow our audience. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.